Well, hi all, and welcome to the final CAP LTER seminar of the 2021 spring semester. This week we will be hearing from Tim Ohlert, PhD candidate in Dr. Scott Collins' lab at the University of New Mexico. Tim is a CAP grad grant recipient who works on drought impacts on desert ecosystems here in the Phoenix area. And hopefully we'll hear some more about that work in his his talk entitled The Ecology of Southwest Deserts, Past, Present, and Future. Take it away, Tim.
Thanks, Marina. Okay, yeah, I am so excited today to get to talk about one of my very favorite topics. We're going to talk about deserts of the southwestern US. And these ecosystems I just find so interesting. They're at the forefront of so much of the change that's going on in our world today. They were already hot, but they're getting hotter. They were already dry, but they're getting drier. There's just a lot of stressful stuff going on in these ecosystems, and the future of them is kind of uncertain. And we get to ask some really big questions like, how will these ecosystems deal with the things going on in the 21st century? Where are these ecosystems headed? And some questions like, what are the long-term goals that we as humans, as managers, have for these ecosystems? How can we measure the success of those goals or of our management? And to what extent can we even control where these ecosystems are heading? These are all really interesting questions that I just love to think about. So I'm going to take you on this journey to try to identify where we've been, the current state of affairs in these ecosystems, and what the future of our deserts look like. So today I'm going to focus on the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, not the Mojave deserts. If you came for that talk, you might have to wait for the next one. But these two ecosystems, the Sonoran and Chihuahuan, are much larger than the Mojave, and for the sake of time, that was a reason to kind of sidestep that desert. But the Sonoran and Chihuahuan are not only largest on the landscape, but largest in my heart. And these two deserts, they have really different natural histories. Their climates are similar in absolute terms. You know, they're both hot, they're both dry, but in many ways they're very different, and we'll get to talk about that. They have really different fire histories and fire patterns, and they share some stressors. Some of the changes going on now are similar between the two, but many are pretty unique to those ecosystems. And with that, they also share some flora, but not a whole lot. Like between these two pictures, you know, how many species are actually in both of these pictures? If we identified every single plant, maybe one. But let's start off here. Oh yeah, and last housekeeping thing, I have these little icons that I made that represent the Sonoran and Chihuahuan Desert, since we'll go back and forth just a little bit in this talk. So if you kind of zone out, or if you need to like go get your Hot Pocket out of the microwave and you come back and you're not sure exactly what desert we're talking about, you can just look up in the upper right hand corner of the screen, and I'll have one of these little icons hanging out there. Okay, let's start with the Sonoran Desert. So the Sonoran Desert is the second largest of the hot deserts of North America. It's known for this very charismatic flora. You have the saguaro cactus, ocotillo. There's just great cactus diversity and like kind of woody, shrubby diversity in the Sonoran Desert. Very different than the Chihuahuan Desert. But it's not just the, you know, kind of the big stuff that's interesting. There's a massive flora of the intershrub zones of the Sonoran Desert, this kind of desert floor. And these include these forbs. So these aren't grasses, even though they're a little bit stringy. So these are forbs, like this is Plantago ovata, otherwise known as blonde plantain or desert Indian wheat. And then this one up here is a pecticaria, or comb seed is the common name. But these types of forbs are really common in the desert floor, and their little flowers that they have contribute to super blooms. I'm sure we've all heard of super blooms, and yeah, and can really make the desert very, very pretty, very characteristic. But yeah, but this desert is not dominated by perennial grasses. In fact, there are almost no perennial grasses in the Phoenix area of the Sonoran Desert. But a lot of people live in the Sonoran Desert right now, especially the valley. But we can also find artifacts of inhabitants from thousands of years ago, including from people and tribes that persist to this day, including the Hopi and the Zuni. We know that the people living on this land for centuries to thousands of years have enjoyed much of the same flora that we enjoy today, like cactus flowers, cactus fruits, agave hearts, mesquite beans, things like that. But the type of people living in the Sonoran Desert now build a lot more structures and bring a lot more different stuff to this landscape than has ever been here before. And that's one thing that makes the CAP LTER a really kind of special place to study all of the things going on in the Sonoran Desert. So here I have just a little map. This is kind of the Phoenix metro area. I'm sure it's familiar to many on the call. Here are the sites for CAP's DesFert experiment, which I'll come back to a little bit later in the talk. But there's also this big precipitation gradient from west to east across the metro area. So this is a picture from White Tank Mountain over here on the far west side. And White Tank, on average, maybe gets 8 inches of rain a year. But way over here at McDowell Mountain on the east side, they'll get like 11 and a half inches of rain a year on average, of course. And so you have this really big precipitation gradient. And so for all these reasons, that makes CAP LTER an ideal area to study present day Sonoran Desert situation. But a little bit about the Chihuahuan Desert to start here. This is the largest of the North American hot deserts. And so I'm really focusing on the northern part of the Chihuahuan Desert. Here we have the Sevilleta LTER in New Mexico. In southern New Mexico, we have the Jornada LTER as well. But this desert's really large, extends very far into Mexico. And there's large ungulates, including the native pronghorn and the non-native oryx that have been on this landscape for quite a while. Certainly the pronghorn have. But there's evidence for people living on this landscape in this desert since well before 500 AD. I can't even conceptualize how old that history is. The Navajo, Apache, Comanche people have lived in this desert for generations, and many of their descendants still live in the desert today. And there's some evidence that these people used some fire as land management of some of their desert landscapes and desert grasslands. But that was all before the pre-Spanish settlement in the 1700s. And when the Spanish came, they started to graze a lot more domesticated animals on the landscape. And that kind of domesticated animal tradition persists to this day. And it means that there are lots of large cattle herds kind of on the grassland being managed. Unlike the Sonoran and Mojave deserts, heavy summer rainfalls help out perennial grasses, which are abundant and dominant on the landscape. Perennial grasses such as these pictured here. And unlike the Sonoran Desert, there isn't a really huge population center in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert. There's Albuquerque and El Paso Juarez, which are sizable cities, but compared to Phoenix, I mean, they're even combined, they're maybe half the size of Phoenix, or the Phoenix metro area. But there's this ecological divide in the Chihuahuan Desert between the grasslands and the shrublands. And the Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge, where the Sevieta LTER is, sits right at that boundary, which makes it really ideal for studying these transitions. And a little bit more exposition before we get into the bones. I wanted to find two variables that are really, really important, those being productivity and diversity. So productivity is just a measure of all of the mass of the plant growth above ground for over a given period of time. So here's our like sample plant community. This is what a plant community might look like. And if you just cut all of the above ground mass and you dried it and weigh it, you get some balls of grass and forbs. And that would be your productivity. And plant ecologists consider productivity to be really important to measuring ecosystems because it can show carbon cycling, provides forage for animals, processes like that. Now the second term being diversity, which we'll measure as species richness. And species richness is just a simple count of the number of species in a given plot. This is probably the most common measure of diversity. So for our little sample plot here, if let's say each circle that I circled was a different species, we would have a species richness of 4 in this plot because there's 4 different colors. And this is a pretty typical desert plot. And plant ecologists regard diversity as important because it can provide some resilience, some stability. Diversity can help buffer environmental stresses. But now we get to transition to the Chihuahuan Desert. So there are 2 major categories of threats in the Chihuahuan Desert that I'd like to go over. One being grazing, and then the second being climate change. And there's a little bit more to unpack there. So we'll start here with the grazing. So here are some of the natural grazers, and they're in pretty low abundance, and they can roam a long ways across the landscape. So this is pronghorn on the left. They're very common, and they can travel, I don't know, miles and miles every day. And this is oryx. Oryx is from Africa, the continent of Africa. I don't know where this species is from, but they were introduced to New Mexico, I don't know, a few decades ago for hunting purposes. And these contrast pretty starkly to the herd animals that can also be seen on this landscape. Herd animals, they tend to exist in pretty high abundance, and they're also fenced in. And so if if they eat all of the grass that's in their little fenced area, they can't just go down to the river or go up into the mountains to kind of eat the stuff there. Spread out a little bit more of where they're eating and the disturbance that's caused by the grazing. There's also a lot of direct disturbance to the soil by livestock, just by they're heavy and they have big hooves, and that can make the inner shrub zones really easily erodable or desertified, disturbed. And grazing of the dominant grasses, we know that grazing of the dominant grasses by some of these less abundant native ones, native animals, is not really a problem for these ecosystems, but overgrazing can put a pretty big dent into the dominant grass communities. So here's some research led by Brandon Bestelmeyer down at the Jornada in the Chihuahuan Desert in southern New Mexico. And this takes a really long, like a centuries-long view of black grama production in this pasture, so this grazed pasture. And black grama, the dominant grass, this is black grama here, it has declined over the past century, but it declined especially or irreparably during this drought in the early 1950s. And in this paper, they posit that the amount of grass in this pasture might have been sustained in the grazing regime, but the interaction between the grazing and the drought led to this new ecosystem with quite a bit less grass and quite a bit more shrub cover over time. And we can also see this at the Sevietta LTR. I really like to just show pictures that tell a clear story. So this is the Sevietta LTR. On this side of the fence is the Sevietta, and on this side of the fence is just a private grazed land. And the Sevietta hasn't been grazed by human placed livestock for 50 years, since the 70s. And you can see all of this kind of gray matter. This is all grass. This is all grass, and there's a lot of gray matter, gray grass matter over here on our non-grazed side. But if we just hop the fence a little bit, we see that there's quite a bit less of that kind of gray area and quite a bit more just shrubs. We have yucca there, that's Gutierrezia, or snakeweed. And we can also take this qualitative view from the satellite, from the satellite vantage point. So here's again the Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge. And if you just hop this one fence right here, that's the fence we were just looking at. And here's now the grazed area, the area that's been pretty continuously grazed every year. And we even see differences between different landowners and how they graze their land. And yeah, over time, this grazing stress leads to a new type of ecosystem, which is much more shrubland than grassland. But for now, let's move on to climate change. So there are three big categories I'm going to address: climate variability, drought, and monsoon changes. So if we start with climate variability, step back, here's a figure from Greg Maurer. He and his team took Met Station, weather station data from the past 100 years. And what they're showing in this graph, so the bluer areas, so SPI is an aridity index. So the bluer areas mean cooler and wetter. The redder areas mean hotter and drier. And this SPI per decade means that over the past 100 years, the bluer areas have been getting slightly wetter and cooler per decade, but the redder areas have been getting hotter and drier per decade. And that is us here down in the southwest region. But we're not here to talk about absolute changes. We're talking about variability. So then this graph over here shows the interannual variability of that aridity index. So the redder areas are getting more variable over time, and the bluer areas are getting less variable over time. And once again, our very own desert Southwest is right in the middle of getting more variable. So it's really important that we understand what the consequences of this are going to be for the future. And a colleague of mine, ASU's very own Lau Girardi, set up this great precipitation variability experiment at the Jornada LTR, where he uses this really like high-tech water capture contraption that can experimentally manipulate the interannual variability of precipitation for plant communities. Really, really cool stuff. And some of the findings include that when the interannual precipitation was increased, the productivity of the plant communities, or the productivity of the dominant grasses, I should say, decreased quite a bit. And at the same time, the greater interannual precipitation variability led to higher productivity of the shrub species. So let's keep this in mind. Greater future climate variability can be expected to increase shrub cover at the same time as it decreases grass cover. But for now, let's move on to drought. So this is of course the state of New Mexico. This is from the U.S. Drought Monitor product, which is a pretty cool product if you haven't looked at it before, and from just a few days ago. Now each color level is a new drought category. And so the darker the red, the hotter the color, the higher the drought. And so it's looking pretty droughty. And if we put this into a historical context, so this is over the last 20 years. Here's the year 2000. And our y-axis here is just what percentage of the southern desert region of New Mexico was in a specific drought category. And we see that not only is New Mexico in an exceptional drought right now, but there are also only a couple times throughout the last 20 years that it's been in a drought as severe in this region. And what this means is that federal lands begin to close for fire precautions. I'm looking down here at D4, although this whole chart is actually quite interesting. We see that animals start to do some weird things when drought is really high. We see that there's less surface water for agriculture, and our rivers start running dry. And so these drought events are expected to only become both more severe and more frequent in the future. So it's very important that we know what to expect from our Chihuahuan Desert grasslands under drought. So we made an experiment. This is an experiment, a drought experiment that I've led along with Alicia Hallmark, Mariah Patton, and my wonderful advisor, Scott Collins. And in this experiment, we reduce the precipitation on the land underneath these shelters by 66%. And we did this treatment for a year, and that's the results that I'll show. But then underneath these experiment treatment shelters, we can measure the plant community, we can calculate productivity, we can calculate species richness, and try to understand what's happening in these ecosystems. So here's some of our results. First and foremost, we saw that there was not a change in species richness. The control plots had the same number of species as the drought plots. However, in those exact same plots, there was a massive decrease in the productivity of those plant communities. And how can we account for this decline if there's the same number of species but way less productivity? What we found was that the dominant grasses, the most abundant plant on the landscape, that was the species that was really taking the biggest hit due to the drought treatment. And so we see, half of the productivity by our dominant grass species in the drought plots as what we observed in the control plots. So black grama, as I said, it's the dominant grass. It is 80% of the plant cover on this landscape. And many organisms rely on it in one way or another. And so this type of disturbance just must have some implications for all of the other taxa in this ecosystem. But for now, let's move on to monsoon seasonality. So the monsoon season in the Chihuahuan Desert is July, August, September. And during just those 3 months, the region gets greater than half of its annual precipitation just in those 3 months alone. So this is just a little climograph, as they say. The light yellow, or the light blue bars are the precipitation on average per month, and then the red lines and the blue line are the temperature across the year. And so you see, during these 3 very wet months, it's also when it's the hottest out. But there are some climate change predictions for the monsoon season. So this is a figure from Cook and Seeger, a couple of climate modelers, and they've modeled where they expect or how they expect precipitation to change in these months going into the 21st century. And so in June, or actually let's go with July. In July, this bar is expected to decrease significantly. I mean, quite a bit less rain will be coming in July. However, in September and October, there's an expected increase in the precipitation received during that time. And so there's this weird trend where the monsoon season is starting to trend backwards into the fall, making more rainfall come when it's a bit cooler out. And we need to figure out what that means for our plant communities. So we made an experiment. This is an experiment led by Scott Collins and Jen Rogers of the University of New Mexico. And in this experiment, we try to move the monsoon season from July and August backwards into the year to September and October. Now, this experiment has been going on since 2012, so we have a lot of really good long-term data on this. And how we do this is we use this panel contraption to collect 100% of the rainfall that drops during July and August. We store it in these big tubs, and then we sprinkle it back onto the plots to mimic a monsoon season in September and October. And what we found was that this has a pretty big effect on our plant communities. So for one, if we look at species richness, here we have various years on the x-axis, your species richness on the y. Now 2012 was a pre-treatment year, so a good little check. There is no difference between the species richness in those years. But we do see over time, on the whole, there is a greater amount of species, a greater number of species in the delayed monsoon plots, these turquoise boxes, than in the control plots. Okay, that's kind of interesting. But if we go over to productivity, we see the opposite, that there's a pretty consistent less productivity in the delayed monsoon plots compared to the controls for each year. And now, if you've really been paying attention, your next question might be, what is the dominant grass doing? And that's a great question. The dominant grass is doing what we've seen it do in all of these other scenarios, where a lot of the productivity being lost in this community can be attributed by losses to the dominant grass. And so here we see black grama cover is consistently quite a bit lower in the delayed monsoon plots than in the control plots. And if you kind of look at it, if you squint a little bit, that difference is only getting greater and greater the longer that the delayed monsoon treatment goes. So right at the beginning, right, the first year of treatment, it's almost the same cover, but then by the end of the treatment, there's, I don't know, 80% less black grama cover in the delayed monsoon plots than the control plots. And so once again, though species richness is increasing on the whole, productivity, and especially the productivity of the dominant grass, is suffering. So that brings us to ask some questions. What will these ecosystems look like in 10, 50, 100 years? We can say with pretty good confidence that there'll be more shrubby. And when these grasslands become shrubbier and become like shrublands, we know that brings increased wind erosion and water erosion to the soil. As far as agricultural goals go, if the agricultural goal is to be able to graze some of these, the livestock wants to eat the grass. They don't want to eat the shrubs, and so it's less productive for those goals. We can see that certain taxa are going to get more diverse, but other certain taxa are likely to get less diverse, such as like grasshoppers. There wouldn't be as many grasshoppers in not a grassland, right? And this also has some implications for carbon storage, which we know a little bit about, but finding out far more the carbon storage potential of grasslands versus shrublands is going to be a really important topic for us to cover in the coming years. So let's put a pin in the Chihuahuan Desert for now. And now, since this is a multimedia format, I'm going to change my background to kind of get us all in the mood for the Sonoran Desert. So yeah, we're moving west. We're moving to the Sonoran Desert, where some of the same threats exist, but most of them are pretty different than what we just discussed in the Chihuahuan Desert. So we're going to talk about urban centers, exotic grasses, nitrogen deposition, and drought over here. Oh, gotta get that drought in there. Okay, and we're back. So urban centers, we have so. For those familiar, this will look exactly like the Phoenix metro area or the valley. And one of the threats to the Sonoran Desert is just kind of this direct overtaking of the desert. We have a lot of land use change, agricultural, urbanization. And we know that globally, habitat loss is one of the largest threats to biodiversity. But I probably don't have to tell all you guys this stuff. This is really the CAP LTER bread and butter. I'm just kind of play acting here. But this type of change introduces all of this new human stuff into the desert ecosystems. It breaks up the landscape for plant and animal movement and colonization. It introduces different oils and different chemicals into the landscape that weren't there before. There are fire threats introduced from camping or cars. There's a lot of direct physical disturbance from like off-roading ATVs. And there's a pretty stark boundary between the human centers and the Sonoran Desert. And I like this picture. This is just a random screen grab street view from I-10 west out of Phoenix. I don't know, maybe somewhere around here. And in this picture, it illustrates that we have Sonoran Desert, beautiful, pristine, and whatnot, right next to one of the country's busiest, most important roadways. And there's just this this pairing. There isn't a little buffer zone between our urban centers and our Sonoran Desert. They're really cohabitating right next to each other. And through a great number of factors, novel conditions are being introduced to this desert ecosystem. One of them being exotic grasses. So schismus, this is Schismus arabicus, or Mediterranean grass is the common name. Schismus is among a number of exotic grasses which are starting to take over the desert floor. Others include buffalo grass and red brome. Schismus was first documented in the Sonoran Desert in the 20s and the 30s, and they've only become more abundant over time as they proliferate and as there's more disturbance, because they really like disturbed areas, these grasses. So any type of land movement or maybe even cattle hooves are likely to kind of bring in some more schismus. And at first approximation, there appears to be some effect of precipitation on schismus. So let me dig into that. So here's our little Phoenix metro area. And we have the White Tank Mountain on the dry west side. In just control plots at White Tank Mountain, over half of the productivity of those communities is coming from grasses, just exotic grasses. But over on the very wet McDowell Mountain on the east side, we see, I mean, greater than 90% of the productivity is coming from grasses. And there are also some other kind of community effects of having all of this schismus present in these communities. So here we have a precipitation gradient, and these are just control plots from White Tank Mountain and McDowell Mountain. We see some species richness effects. So at White Tank Mountain, there isn't a species richness effect. the proportion of schismus in the community is not really representative of the number of species there. But at the high end, there's some evidence that the greater amount of schismus, we're starting to get to fewer species. And if we just do a direct comparison between the sites, there is far more schismus in the McDowell site, and also far fewer species on the whole in the McDowell site. And schismus, though, is very productive. So these are just, still we have schismus proportion of the community compared to the productivity of that community. And we see that where schismus is very productive, that drives the productivity of the whole community. So schismus is very productive. Maybe they can outcompete some of the native forb species. And so the exotic grasses introduce this conflict between productivity and diversity in these communities, where greater productivity in a given year might come at the expense of diversity and the services that diversity brings to an ecosystem. But more on that later. Nitrogen deposition. So nitrogen deposition comes from air pollution. And this has been an issue in the US over the last 40 years. Internal combustion engines and factory work really produce a lot of this nitrogen deposition. And it's especially relevant in and around large metro areas. So if you know your US geography, you can point out LA and Chicago and New York, but you also might be able to point out our very own Phoenix, Arizona, kind of sitting in this otherwise not super nitrogen deposition heavy area. But nitrogen, we know that nitrogen has a lot of direct effects on plants. Plants need nitrogen to grow. That's why when you're trying to make your golf course all green, you can throw a bunch of fertilizer on it and stuff like that. But so we really need to figure out what's going to happen. This like really quite a high levels of nitrogen deposition. What effect is that going to have on our plant communities? And luckily, we have a very long-term experiment set up by the CAP LTER to help answer these questions. So this is the introduction to the DesFert experiment. Used to be called CNDEP for those that are kind of old school. Here we have our very own Sally Whitlinger and Mark Watkins doing some sampling at one of the sites. And let's see, yeah, so every year, some people go out and put some fertilizer, put some nitrogen fertilizer on this kind of desert floor area. And there are a lot of different sites of this. So here are all the sites that I mentioned earlier. You can count them up if you like, but there are a lot of sites which span the precipitation gradient, span kind of an east-west, and even they have a lot of urban sites. So now I'm going to highlight just a little bit of research from CAP's very own Megan Wheeler. Now, there are a lot of, this experiment is very rich and has a lot of different factors being crossed, but I want to just cue you in on the nitrogen treatment exclusively. So each of these panels is a year. Our y-axis is just the species richness. And we really only need to look for now at the white control boxes and the green nitrogen addition boxes. And we see in 2008, at the beginning, there maybe wasn't a whole lot of difference in species richness between those treatments. But as time goes on, this starts to become pretty noticeable. And all of a sudden, it's clear that nitrogen addition has a diminishing effect on diversity. And that's what Megan found in this. And now, at the same time, using the same plots, this is some work led by Julie Shaw that shows we just have our controls and we have our nitrogen treatment. And we see that pretty consistently over the length of the experiment that nitrogen addition leads to greater biomass. So once again, we're finding that increased biomass comes at the expense of diversity, which could create some long-term issues for resilience, stability, and the integrity of the native forb community of the desert floor. But finally, we got to talk about drought. That's kind of my thing, and I do think it's really, really important. So here's the U.S. Drought Monitor for Arizona, and kind of southern Arizona is where we're looking at with this Sonoran Desert. This is just from a couple days ago. And if we put this super, super droughty conditions into context, we see that here in the Sonoran Desert, in south central Arizona region, this is the driest, droughtiest that this region has ever been in the last 20 years, since the beginning of the US Drought Monitor in the year 2000. So here we're seeing, I mean, we're at the forefront of change. These are conditions that we've never seen before in the last 20 years. And what this means is that fire restrictions are increasing. Vegetation greenup is poor. I'm looking here. Vegetation greenup is poor, and if anybody's been out for a hike recently, you'll know that there's not much growing out there. And streams, ponds, lakes are beginning to dry up. And so we're seeing, even just in this chart, how droughts are becoming more frequent, more severe in this landscape. So what do we need to do? We got to put up an experiment to try to figure out what this all means. So we made a drought experiment. And this is the same drought experiment, same type of drought experiment as I talked about earlier in the Chihuahuan Desert. But here we took advantage of the west-east precipitation gradient, and we have two sites, one on the kind of drier west side, the White Tank Mountain, and then one on the wetter east side at McDowell Mountain. And a reminder, this is a 66% reduction of precipitation for 1 year. And we've learned some stuff from this. So once again, just like we saw in the Chihuahuan Desert, we did not see any changes in species richness at either site. Didn't affect overall species richness at all. However, if we then pull into productivity, we see that there was massive changes, similar to the changes that we saw in the Chihuahuan Desert, large changes in productivity at White Tank Mountain, but there was no change overall in productivity at the McDowell Mountain. So what gives? If you'll remember, a massive proportion of the productivity at McDowell comes from schismus grass. And I've been putting it off. I think it's time that we break down these results and kind of put them into context. So schismus increases productivity. Is that good? Perhaps it's good in the short term if productivity is our metric of choice, but there are some long-term consequences to fewer species. Now, nitrogen also increases productivity. Is that good? Different question, but kind of the same answer. In the short term, I mean, productivity, yeah, if that's our metric of choice, but there's some long-term consequences to having less diversity. And now we see with drought that the areas with more schismus are more productive during the drought, or they don't decrease in productivity during the drought. Is that good? Well, here's kind of the ramifications of it. So this is just a picture that I took, probably on accident, if I'm being honest, of the ground cover at McDowell Mountain during the not growing season. And this is all just schismus grass that has dried up on the landscape and is persisting. And during a drought, all the schismus that grew so well during the wet conditions becomes tinder for fires that would otherwise not be very likely to occur in the inner shrub areas of the Sonoran Desert. And this is not hypothetical. Here is footage from this spring from State Highway 87, known as the B line. In August of 2020, a car on the Beeline near McDowell Mountain caught on fire. The flames from the car found some exotic grasses whose productivity had been helped along by nutrient deposition over the past 50 years. And since this part of Arizona has been in one of the most severe droughts in the past 2 decades, all of the senesced exotic grass was now blanketing the desert floor with tinder. It was called the bushfire. It burned 200,000 acres of the Sonoran Desert. And it might never have been the catastrophic fire that it was if it weren't for the intersection of exotic grass, nitrogen deposition, drought, and a car fire. But if it didn't happen in 2020, it didn't happen last year, this type of fire was bound to happen somewhere at some point in time. In fact, there are fires happening right now. If you live in Phoenix and you look out your window, maybe you'll even see one of the helicopters pulling water. The result of this fire and other fires are that plants which are not fire tolerant, like saguaro, shrubs, other cacti, they'll struggle to remain on the landscape long term. Soil erosion will probably change stream and soil chemistry, and that will probably help plant species like schismus and red brome and bufflegrass, which do well in disturbed soil. Exotic grasses in the seed bank will grow just fine during the next water season, and they might outcompete some of the shrub and cacti species. And this all leads to an emerging stable annual grassland ecosystem. This is not total doomsday. Plenty of the Sonoran Desert will remain free from fires like this. But these types of problems will only become more and more of an issue 10, 50, 100 years from now. If we want to mitigate the damage done, we can improve existing deserts and make them more resistant to stressors by promoting the native forb communities or identifying landscapes at risk of these large fires. Hopefully today, we've also learned that productivity isn't always a great metric for judging the success or health of a plant community, and that maybe we would be better off optimizing for diversity or resilience or some other ecosystem service that provides stability to the ecosystem instead of this short-term productivity metric. On some level, though, we're going to have to live with this new annual grassland ecosystem. And I'm all for preserving what can be preserved, but we can think ahead for when it's clear that the grasses are established and in control. How can we improve those ecosystems to fit our goals of stability, resilience, diversity, and many, many other ecosystem services? And so I will now toss the question back to all of the smart people listening. These questions: what specifically do we want from our desert ecosystems, and what do we have to do to get them there? Because these are the questions that will guide us forward. And lest we end on a somber note, these are all the people that helped make this research possible. And these are also all the people that will guide our deserts into the next generation of ecology, management, and conservation. And in the bright, bright hands of these very intelligent, very hardworking people, I couldn't be more optimistic for the future of our deserts. And this includes, I want to point out, some of us were just awarded a 2021 CAP graduate grant: Prabendra Yogi, Liz Fain, Michael Mann, and Mariah Patton. And together we're going to extend our drought research to include a lot of below ground processes and the effects of drought on those. And with that, thank you for listening, and I'll take your questions.
Awesome talk, Tim. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has a question. I can start one off if no one has a burning question. I was wondering if, I know you focus primarily on Black grandma, but did you look at all at any other species-specific biomass And was there, I guess, any difference in the relative abundance of different species in those drought experiments? Like black grama decreased, but relative to other years, another grass increased relative to black grama?
In short, yes. So the all of the grasses, even the subdominant grasses at the Sevietta, are all kind of cut from the same cloth. They're all perennial warm weather grasses, and so all of them do really bad under the drought treatments. So the species that do persist and do okay tend to be more of the forbs, and we do have, it's all anecdotal, but there's a lot of tumbleweed at the Sevietta, and I mean across the Southwest, and tumbleweed likes disturbance, and anecdotally they kind of like the drought plots a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah, great talk, Tim.
Thanks, Nancy.
I was wondering if you could, it's kind of interesting to think about in the very, very dry years when we don't have much of the, the annuals and the exotic grasses coming up. I'm trying to start my video so you can see that I'm actually here. No, it didn't work. Anyway, it seems like it's sort of, we have a more kind of pre-European invasion Sonoran Desert situation. But anytime that we have a wet year, it goes crazy. I mean, it's honestly like 2019, 2020, which was the year that we had the bushfire, was just green and, lots of flowers. Everybody thinks it's wonderful. I don't think it's so wonderful, because then we have exactly this problem that you're talking about with the fires. So I just don't know what the options are. What are the possibilities? These exotic grasses have spread all over the Sonoran Desert. So in wet years, you're just going to get a lot of grass growth.
Yeah, as far as management goes, and I think there are a lot of open questions as to how we proceed. But as far as management goes, part of it is just being aware that after a wet season is going to be if there's a dry season, it'll be even worse than just your average dry season. So it's not just, is it dry right now, but what was it a year ago? Mm-hmm. And also part of the importance is, I think identifying places of most concern. So small isolated fires, if they are small and isolated, are not a very big problem. And it's really when it's these mega fires that are so important to avoid. And so identifying places where the exotic grass is more flammable, more established, anything like that, or where there's fewer natural fire breaks, that can all help us reduce the extent of massive fires.
Yeah. No,
I have some. I'll do some questions from the chat. So where in the McDowells was this research? So CAP has a couple sites in the McDowells. So CAP has McDowell North, which is like it's in the park. Well, they're both in the McDowell Preserve, but this is on the north side by Eagle Camp. If you're very familiar with the McDowells. This is on the south side. So all the drought research was done at McDowell South, as it's called, which is just north of Fountain Hills. And why the focus on schismus in the Sonoran? Red brome is very prevalent, but it appears in our sampling plots, but schismus ends up being a lot more. I think the reason for that is that red brome tends to like kind of ravines, places with slopes. And we purposefully don't put our plots on slopes because, you know, if you're fertilizing the slope, you'll go down the slope. And if your trout shelter is on a slope, you can't really control for water rushing in. So yeah, that, I mean, a huge part of the invasive grass story is red brome.
I could also add that when we set up these plots, we were looking for a particular community, which was more the creosote bush dominated fir sage type of community, and less the sort of upland Sonoran that you often see with the saguaros and palo verdes and so forth. The second year of the project, all the burr sage died in all of the plots. It's a dry year.
Yeah.
Well, I guess just to follow up on that, Tim. So I mean, we get in just next door in the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. We don't actually get that much of that kind of schismus, but we get the barbatus, and it's really tiny and but kind of maybe lower to the ground, whereas brome is kind of more wispy and harder to capture in percent cover. So I don't know, maybe that accounts for some of it, but I guess I was just surprised because I don't really think about schismus, but I'm super worried about red brome. And I was just wondering if it was just, obviously it's really different around the valley, given how much you see of it over on White Tanks too.
Yeah, thanks for being with us, Helen. Yeah, I guess I think I got my nouns mixed up. These you're from the Sonoran Preserve, the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. These are from the McDowell Mountain Regional Park. I think I used the word preserve.
Yeah, we got that. No worries.
Okay.
All right, we are at 4. So unless anyone has any burning questions, let's thank Tim again for a fantastic talk.
Nice job. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, and I hope everyone has a fantastic Friday. Thanks for coming.